Thanks so much for inviting me to speak, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So, yeah, I'm going to be reflecting really on a decade since I wrote a paper for MSOR Connections on this on students as partners in mathematics, and just to give a little bit of background to that, I've been at the University of Exeter since 2007. Exeter had been known for its Students as Partners program called the Students as Change Agents. Liz Dunn had done a lot of work on that and had published some stuff with Rose Zanstra. And in fact, there was a book published called The Student Engagement Handbook by Durfel Owen and Liz Dunn that came out following all that work. And I contributed part of a chapter to that. So I'd got involved with all this Students as Partners stuff from a very, very early stage in my career at Exeter. And on the back of some of those internal projects and some externally funded stuff around this, I got asked to do a piece on Students as Partners and looking at this across UK mathematics, higher education, and highlighting some interesting practice. It originally started actually as a workshop, is what I was asked to do. So I generated some interesting case studies that we're going to discuss, etc. But it was a time when some of the stuff in the Higher Education Academy there was some shocks to that, and in the end, I got asked to write it up as a paper, so that's what I did. I categorized the various partnerships that are discussed into different categories. So students as researchers, we have plenty of experience of that, and we've seen some of that from, for example, Kevin and them working on the stuff on the MathLib library for Lean. Students as educators, and there are lots of examples of that around things like peer-assisted learning schemes and all sorts of other examples. Students as ambassadors, again, lots of interesting work around that, things like science fairs, recruitment into universities, going out to schools, and students as managers. And even now, sort of 9 years on, I think that last one is perhaps where we're weakest in terms of student partnerships. I think there are still many more examples of those first three, many less where students are really working alongside us in the sort of management of their education experience. I think, for example, at the level of sort of directors of education, those are staff. We tend not to have equivalent student roles. Even the chair of an SSLC doesn't really have the same sort of impact and status as say, a director of education. And it was a challenge I put in the paper about whether we should think about this. And I'm not sure there's been much movement on that, but maybe someone will tell me I'm wrong. And borrowing or slightly refining a diagram from Zanstra and Dunn, my view is certainly that our most successful initiatives tend to be ones that emphasize student action over student voice and a current impact over a delayed impact. And when you think about issues such as students perhaps not filling out forms at the end of a module saying how it went, it's because that's not an emphasis on action, it's an emphasis on just their voice, and it doesn't have any impact on them. It potentially has an impact on future cohorts of students. So, okay, response rates are low. If we can do things to move those interactions from student voice to student action and from a delayed impact to a current impact on those students, then we are likely to get much better engagement and much better quality of these student partnerships, is my view. So the decade in the title is really since that paper in 2014. What are my reflections? How have things sort of changed for me in terms of the student partnerships that I've been engaged in, but also my thinking around some of this stuff? And that's what I wanted to touch upon. One of the really exciting examples that struck me in the paper as I was talking to people was this idea of we give value, we indicate value to students about what they do, often by rather transactionally giving them marks or credits. So there were some interesting examples of modules that were in some sense accrediting ambassadorial work. Say the example that is in the paper is Chris Budd's communicating mathematics module at the University of Bath that was linked to the Big Bang Science Fair. So students would go and be part of a presentation there and some interactive demonstration, and then write that up, and they would get credits in the curriculum for it. And I had previously done some work on this, and had some students review the curriculum and design a group project module for our third year, which allowed us to do some of this partially. Students could engage in education type research projects and get credits for that. But I wanted something that could showcase the less tangible contributions that they had, and were at the time only being recognised in an extracurricular award. So lots of institutions have their own versions of Exeter awards for sort of extracurricular activities. I felt that this stuff was important enough that we should be offering credit. So anyway, I designed a module called Ambassadors for Science, which ran for the first time in 2016. And the idea is there that students who are engaged in things like peer-assisted learning as mentors, or in outreach as ambassadors, or in our staff student liaison committees, or other things like that, could write about their ambassadorial role. They would reflect on it, they'd evaluate it properly, they would map it to the Associate Fellow Descriptor of the UK Professional Standards Framework, which hopefully everyone's familiar with. Formerly of Higher Education Academy, now Advanced HE, and produce a portfolio. And as an example there, just a screenshot of one of the students' portfolios, just a small part of it. And in fact, this student worked both as a peer-assisted learning mentor and as a chair of a staff student liaison committee. And in fact, that background is their own artwork. So phenomenal opportunity really for them to showcase talents that they wouldn't otherwise have had the opportunity to do within the curriculum. Anyway, it's only ever small numbers of students each year. 41 students taken the module since that 2016 start. And there has been a noticeable drop-off during the pandemic because there's been a reduction in ambassadorial opportunities, and schemes have been slow to start back up. But the sort of good news from the point of view of this approach is the university is considering expanding it to some institution-wide version of this sort of module, particularly around some strategically important initiatives like, for example, decolonisation and rethinking assessment. So if they can get groups of students working on this and accredit that within the curriculum, the university is quite interested in that. I don't know how it is at other universities, but I'm very fortunate at Exeter in that we have something called the Education Incubator. Kevin mentioned getting some internal funding from Imperial for some of the work he was doing. The Education Incubator at Exeter is set up to do exactly that sort of thing. So it was launched in 2017. The idea is that it provides funding and support for innovative education projects, and student partnership working is right at the heart of all that. The expectation is that students aren't just working alongside you, but actually co-managing the project, etc., and are really engaged and invested in it. I've had various funded projects with the Education Incubator, and I've put a few there on that particular slide. But all involve partnership working with students to either evaluate the effectiveness of something or to improve our support, say, for autistic students through the Exeter Spectrum programme. One of the projects that I had in 2020 to 21 really has had quite an impact on my thinking around student partnerships and the sort of things we do when we talk about co-creation. And this was a project called Rethinking Education Through the Lens of Parallel Text, which is a bit cryptic, so I'll try to unpackage it for you. But this was a project with Layal Hakim, who's now one of our Directors of Education Student Experience in Maths and Statistics at Exeter, and Leif Isaacson, who's the Director of Digital Humanities at Exeter. And the idea is the following. You could hypothesize that education at every level, whether you're thinking about managing a whole curriculum or just a teaching session, can be thought of as curating a corpus of parallel resources. So here you might think of face-to-face classes as being a sort of resource, or text in the language of humanities. You've got learning resources, slides, notes, exercise sheets, solutions, which all relate in some way to each other and potentially to the face-to-face session that you're thinking of, or the schedule of sessions. You might have course pages in learning management systems, descriptors for modules, for programs, there's a whole corpus of material relating to that education experience. And we have experts in curating, particularly digital corpora, and there are tools developed to help do this. So if we want to hypothesize that education is like managing this big corpus of material, and parallel texts, etc., can we learn stuff from people who actually understand how to manage corpora and the tools that are needed to do so? And you might think it's stretching the point, but I feel you can take the analogy quite far. So if you've got a recording of a lecture, that might be argued to be a parallel version of the corresponding slides or notes or board annotations. You might argue that if you give out an exercise sheet, solutions that come in, including your own, are commentaries on those exercises, etc. And students have their own annotated versions of notes, perhaps with their own examples. These are, in some sense, parallel versions of the lecturer's own copies. So, as I say, you can push this analogy as far as you like. I found it really interesting to think about education in this way, because it highlighted various things to me. First of all, that there's all sorts of similarities and differences between all these various parallel resources within the corpus. And there are interrelationships between those. And all those things are really valuable. And just to take an example from a sort of humanities type background, if we think about the Gospels in the New Testament, there are lots of examples throughout the early history of the church where church fathers tried to harmonize, say, the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, take all of them, put them together into a single sort of agreed document. But that doesn't capture everything that's in those three synoptic Gospels. You lose some things. You lose the author's voice, for example. Sometimes they gloss over some of the differences, all sorts of things. So the corpus and its relationships between the various elements is more than what can be synthesized from it in a co-created agreed product. There is more value there than just being able to smash it together and say, there's an agreed thing. And it strikes me that there are certain forms of co-creation where we get a group of students and staff to create a thing that, if we're not careful, result in the elimination or reduction of some voices. So we need to actively sometimes work against that. And I've come to use the word co-curation as a form of co-creation where we're actually actively trying to preserve those differences within the corpus and understand it, expand the corpus, connect it more. And I just feel that's an extremely important and valuable form of co-creation that we could use a lot. Another thing that struck me, and this will link later also to some of the stuff on decolonisation, is that throughout the lecturer's voice is hugely privileged in many of our education corpora. And that's something we should also reflect on and make sure, as best we can, we use that privilege to change that balance. This year, each year I run a third year module for 70 to 100 students on graphs, networks and algorithms. And this year I thought we'd have a little play with some of these underlying ideas around corpora and comparing them, etc. Now, when you actually have a look at this, often the tools that are used for analyzing certain elements of a corpus, they are very specialized and often developed bespoke for that specific corpus, the sorts of things you're looking at, whether they're text you want to actually compare side by side or whatever it might be. But I thought what we could do is we could have a little play with this idea of comparing different interconnected webs of resources or certain viewpoints. And I'll explain exactly the task that I gave them in a moment. But here's an example. This is an example at the bottom of that slide of taking what are usually presented as simply elements on a learning management system and connecting them up in some hopefully more meaningful way by indicating the connections between them. How various things such as my solutions to an exercise sheet solve that exercise sheet, and that exercise sheet is testing certain element in my notes, and those notes link to videos which are parallel versions of some of these things, etc. And each of those in the actual version are clickable links. So if students wanted to, they could click through and go to the actual elements in the learning management system. So the reason this fits into that module is because all this semantic structure is essentially a directed labeled graph, as that picture demonstrates. So what I asked students to do was essentially to map their own journey through the undergraduate curriculum. So the modules they took, how they relate to each other, and tag them to the corresponding mathematics subject classification codes. And there is an element of subjectivity in there, deliberately so, and of course difference because students take different journeys throughout the curriculum, and so these things would be expected to be different. And there in the picture, what I've done is I've taken two students' directed labeled networks. It indicated the intersection there in the sort of purpley pink color, and then the symmetric differences in the red and yellow. Anyway, what we did was they stored these as RDF triple stores. We tried to see if they could come up with some formal measures of difference or similarity for those, for those graphs. That captured their intuition about how similar these things were. And so there's an example, and again, that actually is interactive. There are mouse over things if you do it in Mathematica. So that was fun. And as a way of teaching, actually, we did that through workshops each week, a 1 hour workshop each week, where I basically didn't know Mathematica before the start of this year. So very quickly, the students became as expert as me, a bit like Kevin suggested on Lean. And it's a problem where, okay, these are difficult things. Actually, it's very difficult to come up with any sort of measure that captures what you want. So there's lots you can try, but we were genuinely having conversations in the class about, okay, how can we do this? What sorts of things should we try? And then my last slide is just to reflect on this from a sort of decolonisation point of view. And I've spoken to all sorts of people, particularly in maths and sciences, that say, oh, there's no need to decolonise maths or science, etc. It's all fact, isn't it? But I think that there's all sorts of analogues between what I've learned through that parallel text project and decolonisation. You might not agree with me, but certainly I see that some of what constitutes mathematics now and historically is happenstance. Some is by agreement, and that might be argued to be some sort of social constructivist approach. But then you can ask the question of who agreed on behalf of whom, etc. Some has definitely been through willful obfuscation, theft, or misattribution. And there are definitely certain voices and stories that are privileged within our mathematical corpus. And we have a responsibility, if we have a position of privilege, to promote other voices. And then just to come back to our current challenge around things like generative AI and ChatGPT, I think all these things, debates, disagreements, comparisons, deceit, they're all really powerful tools for teaching mathematics and what it means to have a good definition, a good proof, all that sort of stuff. So anyway, I will leave that there in terms of my reflections.